We should start, and so thank you everyone for coming. As I say, just as a reminder to everyone that you can taking part means you consent to the recording that will be uploaded by Tazza subsequently, because I'm sure lots of people can't come, but I've already had one request from Belinda Wheaton in New Zealand asking, you know, will it be available if she can't make it? So that's fine. So obviously, first we should start with the acknowledgement of country. Obviously, I appreciate we're all spread around. The Institute for Culture and Society, where I'm based, is on the country of the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and the university acknowledges its ancestors who've been traditional owners of their country for thousands of years. I'm currently on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I'm sure, say, everyone is in another part of First Peoples land. So we pay our respect to Darug and Gadigal people, past, present, and emerging. So thank you. Thank you for, and if there's any Indigenous person taking part, obviously you're especially welcome to this. Well, thank you for attending. It was, I guess it was my idea, so that in this very difficult year, when we would normally be meeting in physical space, and I was thinking fondly of Parramatta last year, where we were all were together, and it obviously can't happen. So it was, I think it's very useful for us, important for us still to be present and active, and to talk to each other in small or large groups, and in perpetuity later on online. The way that this will run out, I'll say a few words, then Catherine Palmer is co-convenor of the renamed Sport and Leisure thematic section. We'll have a few welcoming words, and then we'll run through some presentations by specialists in sport and leisure. I'll say a few words, followed by Jennifer Cheng, Ramón Spaaij, and Catherine Palmer, and then we'll go into as lengthy a question and answer discussion section, so that there'll be plenty of time for people to make comment. And probably, given the constraints of time, I guess I'd ask you to save up your comments and questions to be addressed at the end of the four presentations, unless there's something really urgent. And yes, obviously, if you would use the chat function. Apparently, if you drop out unexpectedly, you can rejoin with the same link, I believe. So that'd be right, Jennifer? Yeah. So hopefully we'll be around for the next bit under 90 minutes. Okay. The idea of having this is, in particular, I think, because, you know, we're talking about the now normal and this very unusual year, and the place of sport and leisure in this year. The pandemic year has been dropping in and out, and so we think it's very important to have this discussion within sociology. But next, I'll just pass to Catherine, if she wouldn't mind saying a few words on behalf of the thematic section.
Yep. No, no problem. Thank you, David. And I'm coming to you from Hobart, where I pay my respects to the Muwinina people who are the traditional owners and custodians of Sandy Bay, which is where the Sandy Bay campus, where I live and work and live, built. And welcome on behalf of, I know Adele Pavlidis is here as well. So I'll just talk very quickly about the sport and leisure thematic group. So it's convened by Adele Pavlidis, who's based at Griffith University, myself at UTAS, and Suzanne Schrinder, who's based at Victoria University, but is currently in the United States. So Suzanne is our North American correspondent, basically. And really, the overarching objective of the group is to build and promote research and scholarship in the sociology of sport across Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. So it's a really broad remit that we have, and really welcome ideas for anything that you would like the group to do. I've just come from, and Adele's just come from, a thematic group conveners meeting where the prospect of some money for particular events was raised. Don't get excited, it's not a huge amount of money. It'll be about $2,000. But if there are particular things that you have in mind for what might be a virtual event, but what might be an in-person event down the track in the second half of next year, then get in touch with any of those. And yeah, we really also welcome receiving any details about any new publications that you might have, details of any grants that you might have secured, PhDs that you might have awarded, and so on. And we can put that in our newsletter. There is a webinar on Thursday, the 10th of December at 1 o'clock in the regular TASA Thursday series, where Adele, Suzanne and I will be talking about some of our research to the theme of sport, leisure and the new normal. So sociological insights for developing an agenda for change. So please come along to that one. And so that's Thursday, the 10th of December, 1 o'clock. And we also have a Twitter handle at @TASA_sport, where we share details of publications, live conference updates, things that are happening in the world of sport, and so on and so forth, PhD scholarships for announcements, job opportunities, and so on. So get tweeting. And we also put out a newsletter a couple of times a year where we can share and celebrate the achievements of the membership group. Current numbers are about 30 across postgraduate students and academic staff. So please do encourage postgraduate students, honours students, early career researchers, colleagues, your mates, and so on to join. But the main thing to note is our change of name. So earlier in the year, we changed from the Sociology of Sport thematic group to the Sociology of Sport and Leisure thematic group, and that's a way of recognising the breadth, the breadth of research activity that sits within leisure and sport, physical activities, physical cultures, and so on. All of those broadly defined. Adele, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that. Happy to take a couple of quick questions from either myself or Adele. Otherwise, we can hand back to David. Just it comes through on the chat.
Thanks, Catherine. That was a great intro, and it's been a strange year, of course, but I think we'll definitely try to think of a thematic group event for next year. Applications are due on March the 1st, so if there's any input or ideas, feel free to get in touch. And we'll also think about something for Social Science Week. So there was mention about, the rising cost of sociology degrees. Maybe we could look at doing some kind of competition around sociology of sport and leisure. I'm sure students could get pretty excited about different topics in that. And yeah, so just thinking about different engagement strategies, I suppose, but just with limited resources, of course. But yeah, great to be here. Looking forward to it.
Excellent. Thank you, Adele, and masquerading as Kim on screen.
Yes, I know.
Okay, so I'll just kick things off, maybe to elaborate on the abstract in the first instance, why I think we need to have this discussion. So I mean first that there is a big event going on in the world, which is affecting us in all areas of our lives, and sociology in general and in its various subdisciplinary formations needs to address this issue, but not only the pandemic. And I think that that's important. And the people I invited along to speak are specialists in a range of areas today: ethnicity, religion, gender, sport for development, participation, inclusion, culture, media, and in other dimensions of sport and leisure. So I think we can cover a really broad area. That's what I'm looking for. And if there are other areas that we haven't addressed, I think it's very important for people to contribute there. And I'd say there are two principal questions which I've asked us to consider. How can the sociology of sport and leisure come to terms with the intellectual and social problems that pre-existed, persisted, and have now been exacerbated by the pandemic? Now, I'm taking part in a panel tomorrow, plenary panel tomorrow, and I've been asked to talk a bit about research in the now normal. And it occurs to me that one of the things that we need to do is not regard the pandemic as, in some sociological sense, or in any other, what in contract law is called force majeure. You know, I don't know if people know what force majeure is. I kind of vaguely knew it, and then I had to remind myself what it is. And it essentially means act of God, that something has happened in the world that for which nobody is responsible. Like the equivalent of being struck by another planet or something, a meteorite, and therefore all the rules are changed, and everybody has to be flexible and agile and so on to deal with this new situation. My concern is, in some ways it takes me back to some of the debates about globalization. People probably don't remember that globalization, as a concept, was barely used until the end of the 20th century. And it entered popular usage. And then there was an argument that, well, globalization is a bit like a force majeure. No one can control it. Everyone has to deal with it, usually by being infinitely flexible as a human subject. And before that, various other natural disasters, other pandemics, world wars, and so on. There are always major events happening. I think there's a bit of a conceit that each of us lives in a uniquely troubled and crisis-ridden world, whereas I think that is the world is prone to the human world, and the natural world is prone to crises. But what I think we have to be keep very close eye on is what is the pandemic an alibi for, in terms of relations of power? Like it's all very well to say who has to deal with the pandemic, but you know, we all have to in some level, but who does it affect most, and who is required to adjust the most? And this is, you know, a major case. You know, sport and leisure is a major test case of that. I mean, we had major debates within Australia and in other parts of the world about, for example, the conduct of sporting competitions, the movement of players and coaching staff and so on, the attendance of fans, the involvement of the media, like a real debate about, I mean, I'm particularly interested in mediated sport, a claim that was frequently made that it is such an important area. It's like an essential service that it has to override other questions of other matters such as public health. But also within the institution of sport, then who was going to be one of the major victims, or you know, whose interests were most likely to be sacrificed? And for example, it was pointed out that, strangely enough, you know, women's sport, which was on the rise, suddenly became, you know, the immediately targeted and earmarked for retrenchment and for pulling back on some of those gains in the interests of the whole institution. And I mean, that for me, and there are many other examples, revealed that sport and broadly leisure are embedded in social hierarchies, and that whenever anything happens, whether it's business as usual or a crisis, there is a constant battle for for position, to hold your position, to advance your position against alternative interests, entrenched interest groups, be they class-based, sex, gender-based, racial, ethnic-based, etc. The second question then is, for me, where we would situate this now normal moment in the future, because one tends to be caught up in the moment, you know, the presentism, as it's called, of the moment. Is this a decisive break with the past? Or is it a repetition? And I use a bit of a joke here, going back to Marx's joke, which he actually pinched, but it was his joke about history, you know, playing twice. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. And I'm thinking, but what we now call farce, in like a third form, is the competitive reality media genre. Everything is shot through with a kind of Game of Thrones style struggle for resources, played out in the public sphere with a number of claims makers demanding, my sport is more important than your sport, this bit of the social institution of sport is more vital than another. So, I mean, those are the general questions that I wanted to raise. And I say my particular area is media. And I mean, quite clearly, there's been a battle going on in what I call the media sports cultural complex about the relationship between sport and media. It's a long-standing battle. There's a question of the mutual interdependence. It is also one of long-term structural conflict, and I'm happy to elaborate on the consequences there for arising from the pandemic. Okay, so those are my words to set things up. I'd like now to shift to the next speaker, Jennifer Cheng from Western Sydney University. We haven't talked in any great deal detail about what she's going to say, so I'm as interested to hear as everybody else. So over to you, Jennifer.
Thanks, David. Hi, I'm zooming to you all from the Camarago lands, which is located on the lower north shore of Sydney. So my presentation isn't that COVID specific, though I will mention it briefly. So maybe you will all appreciate a bit of a break from talking about COVID. So this talk is based on a recent project I've only just finished the data collection for, like literally 2 weeks ago. So they're only very, very early preliminary thoughts, probably not even findings. I'm looking at cultural and gender diversity in children's extracurricular activities in Sydney. And one part of the project was looking at extracurricular providers' point of view. And that's the part I'll be focusing on today. So what do we know already? We know that children from culturally diverse backgrounds do not participate in extracurricular activities at the same rate as children from Anglo backgrounds. And we also know that girls do not participate in sporting activities at the same rate as boys. And this gets worse as they get older into the teen years. We also know that parental resources, particularly time and money, play a large role in whether children take part in activities and in how many activities. And also children's interests and desires will play a role as well. But something that the literature hasn't really looked at is what about the extracurricular providers who are actually offering and running the activities? So this is a part of the story that we know very little about. What do they do to reach parents, children, and potential participants? How do they conceptualize gender and culture, and how does this impact inclusion? So as part of the project, we surveyed providers and we interviewed 12 different extracurricular providers across Sydney, so from all various suburbs and areas of Sydney. So out of the 12 providers, only 2 reported having changed their marketing strategies or their programs to accommodate for children of different gender or different culture or ethnicity. One of them was a cycling club, and the organizer told me that they actually deliberately reduced their fees to make the fees as cheap as possible, because he's aware that migrant families do not have a lot of money. They can't prioritize extracurricular activities. So he makes the fees as low as possible to get them into the sport. He also adopted a gender equality policy, and actually as a result of my interview with him. So I had some subsequent emails with him, and he wrote back to me, your questions made me think more about what we are doing or not doing for girls. The day after I wrote to you, I pitched a new policy to the committee to help balance the genders. It's not much and still in the early stages, but basically it allows a new rider to have a membership, all events paid for, and a race-ready bicycle to take home for 6 months for just $110 and an active kids voucher. The active kids voucher is in New South Wales, allows parents to get $100 in the first half of the year and another $100 in the second half of the year. I could just show you, and I'm sure he wouldn't mind me outing the actual cycling club. So I can just quickly share my screen. I hope that works. Can you all see that? So this is the page that he set up actually after talking to me. And so if you see here under our commitment, he says, if the gender ratio for an age category drops below 40%, we will provide support by offering discounted access to our impressive loan bike fleet, registration and race entries for a whole season. And then it talks about which years, like birth years, they're actually targeting, because he wants to get a 50-50 balance of genders. So that's that was the main one that actually did something in terms of gender equality. The second one, she didn't elaborate as much, but she just said, well, she runs a dance school. So she's talking about how they're trying to target boys, because as you can imagine, boys tend to shy away from dance. And she gave the number. So it's approximately like 17% of the dance studio students are boys, which is quite low. And she also just mentioned that she considers cultural diversity in advertising and said, I will make sure that I'm not just putting all the white blonde kids in the front of the programs and on advertising, because this suburb is very multicultural, so that wouldn't be smart. Apart from these two participants, the others took quite a different attitude to the issues of diversity. And so just based on my very quick analysis of the situation, I came up with 3 different approaches. So they actually adopted one or a combination of these approaches. The first one I call a neoliberal market approach. So they thought, if I get enough participants, I don't need to worry about who they are, where they're from, you know, how many boys I've got, how many girls I've got, because I'm making enough money, I'm making a profit, I'm filling all the seats. And they said, well, if I didn't get enough participants, of course I would be looking further, but I do, so it doesn't matter. The second one was a seemingly neutral stance. So our demographics reflect the demographics of this area. That's just, you know, the way it is. So this is not a diverse area. And the third one was a kind of color or gender blind approach. And they say, look, we welcome everybody. Everybody's welcome to join. We accept everybody of every culture. We accept all genders. We don't turn anyone away. If they want to play, if they want to participate, then of course, you know, we welcome them. But they don't really consider what that actually means. You know, how do people actually come to join that activity or that sport? How do people find out about it? How do they feel welcome or comfortable in that environment? So you may be wondering, how did COVID change things? Not surprisingly, it made things worse, in my opinion. I don't actually have statistics on it, but it's just my impression. So during shutdown, it was just about keeping the current students happy. So they tried to offer certain things online. Some things worked better than others. Some things didn't really work at all, but I think it was just trying to not lose students, basically. And then after the restrictions eased, there was still a kind of, you know, number of people per square meter restriction. So they had to then calculate, you know, how big is my space? How many students can I have? They couldn't have as many students as they had before, meaning that there's no incentive to actually seek out new students because they're usually struggling with the numbers that they have already. Space also became an issue. One basketball coach said that there were fewer places available for hire. Schools generally didn't want to hire out their courts and their halls anymore, I guess obviously because of hygiene reasons. And he said they may actually have to shrink the next season and have up to 38 fewer teams just because we don't have access to enough courts for the games. So it seems likely, like with the restriction on the number of students, they're just going for the lowest hanging fruit. Whoever, you know, gets in first gets the spots, and there's no need to really think about or reconceptualize programs or advertising. So why is this important? My interviews with the parents have shown that first generation migrant parents tend to rely heavily on word of mouth about activities, and peer pressure makes an activity worth doing or not worth doing. So if nobody else from that community is doing an activity, then they don't want to do it either because it seems like that activity has no value. And the opposite is true. So if everybody else is doing it, they want to get on the bandwagon and they want to do it too. And I think that this leads to a kind of activity segregation where certain people from certain backgrounds are doing activities in heavy numbers and not doing others at all. It's a similar thing with gender, except this comes more from the children themselves. So if a girl, you know, in her early teens sees that it's getting, you know, there are very few girls are dropping out, they tend to want to drop out themselves as well. Same with boys. If they perceive a sport to be a girl sport, they won't want to continue. And the interesting thing is that children tend to want to continue the activity if they either feel very passionate about it or they're very talented at it, or they're doing it for the social aspect. So they might not love the activity per se, but they want to see the other people, they want to make friends, and they just like being around the other kids. So that, you know, creating that kind of welcoming environment where everybody feels included is very important, because you don't want to just rely on those kids who are naturally talented at that particular thing. So we can see how program design and marketing strategies play a role in the field, how the field currently looks in terms of demographics and how inclusive and welcoming the environment is. As I said, I haven't got very far in the data analysis, so I haven't got any wide-reaching or riveting conclusions yet. So I would really appreciate your questions or your feedback on this. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. I've got my my timer on here, which is my disciplinary technology that I was going to that will, I think, goes off at the right moment and will hopefully control the other speakers, including should have said myself. Yeah, well, thank you for that. That was, I think you touched on a number of kind of key themes there that, you know, we can explore. And let's see if this makes, yes, it's making a nice noise. So it won't stop. Okay, next. Sorry about that. I'll get better at this. Over to you, Ramón, from Ramón Spaaij from the Victoria University in Melbourne, and I'll be playing this after 10 minutes. Okay.
Thank you, David. And you might need to, and yes, please feel free to do so. In fact, yeah, absolutely. And I'm on Wurundjeri land with you today. So basically what I will do is I'll share my screen just for some visuals. Yeah, can you all see the screen? Perfect. So first of all, I say I really, you know, I'm really grateful that we're having this panel today. I'm really grateful for the fantastic contributions from the panel and the audience that we'll be having today, because it really feeds into and is part of sort of a conversation that's already being had. So I've just, the last couple of weeks, I've been reading through, okay, what's already been written on sort of sport in and beyond the pandemic. And I was really interested to see that some really interesting things are emerging from actually the sociology of sport and leisure. I think there's a real distinct contribution to be made. And it goes really to the heart of really two things. I think one is reflected in David's article in the Journal of Sociology, is around really thinking about the structural imbalance or the structural or the cultural problems that already existed in sport pre-COVID, right? How do we ensure that we don't reinforce, reproduce, or exacerbate, but actually take this as an opportunity to rethink and recalibrate, right? And potentially transform sport. And definitely, as David points out in that article, sociology must play a role in that. And therefore, we all have sort of an obligation, I guess, to be part of that. So obviously, it's really too early to draw any sort of long-term, know really about the long-term impacts and to draw any firm conclusions. So what I offer really, I would kind of categorize as sound bites, some preliminary ideas, and particularly questions. I'm really good at asking questions, way worse at providing answers. So that might be useful in the context of a panel. So we'll just see how we go. So there are kind of 5 points, and they come from my own position now, my own sort of areas of interest, of course, why I've highlighted those that I think are really interested. I'm really interested in moving forward in bringing into sort of scholarship and so knowledge production and application in the sociology of sport and leisure, and how we might inform sport in all its facets at all levels, thinking with and through sort of the consequences of the pandemic. So the first is, for me, there's an opportunity to re-enchant sport by reclaiming the ludic. So it's quite interesting that sport business is rethinking its, rethinking its business models And I think here, maybe there's an opportunity here to use Max Weber's well-known terminology to re-enchant some sport. That is by reclaiming, re-engaging the ludic and the aesthetic. So particularly the play element. And it comes partly from research I've been involved in, and it might be linked to some of Jennifer's work around sort of putting kids first and really going really back to the basis of sport and leisure as play, as fun. So around fun, creativity, and imagination, and particularly also collective imagination. And so we're here trying to mobilize our sociological imaginations. And I think, well, there's something here really offer at a time when hyper-commercialized sport is sort of grappling to come to terms with well, all sorts of ramifications of the pandemic. So I think that really thinking about, well, how might this potentially be an opportunity to re-enchant sport and leisure, I think would be the first point. The second is, and this is really a bit of a thing of mine, all these points will say a lot about my own training and where I've been sort of in different universities, is to do with rethinking sociality, right, in sport and leisure in terms of physical distancing, and particularly the micro-sociality. So the last 5-6 years, having always been, being trained in sort of the work of Irving Goffman and other micro-sociologists, really interested particularly in the work of Randall Collins and this idea that it's that sort of these moments of mutually focused attention and bodily co-presence that produce what Durkheim called collective effervescence, group solidarity, and symbols of membership, right? And that's a lot of when we think about sport, inclusion, social cohesion, social change, can be broken down, I think, ultimately in these micro moments. That is where a lot of that happens. So we started quite macro, and I'm quite interested in looking at the micro. So what does that mean? Because if we think about sport, physical activity, we think about sweaty bodies in close proximities, mass gatherings of spectators, whereas now maybe what might be emerging is sort of more what so Randall Collins talks about interaction rituals, right? And that we see now the rise. I think actually it's not so much the rise, but the evolution of hybrid rituals, where that online and offline become really intertwined and co-constitutive. I'm quite interested in how that works. So Randall Collins has done a lot of work on comparing online and offline rituals, and actually argues that it doesn't, digital rituals don't work the same way and actually present real challenges in producing sort of human solidarity in ways. And those of you who teach, that probably doesn't come as a surprise, having tried to whip up that same emotional energy and kind of solidarity in the classroom online. I found that particularly challenging, and there's been, successes and failures, but it really allows us sort of to rethink some of that, particularly around how do face-to-face and digital rituals interact in sport and leisure moving forward, and what kind of new forms of social engagement, sociality, potentially solidarity and conflict might that produce. So a lot of questions there and no answers, but some theoretical kind of, pointers, I guess. The third one really goes also to what Jennifer talked about, and sort of, diversity inclusion is a big passion of mine. I know it's also for Catherine, and it's reflected in Jennifer's work. And really about sort of, okay, we already know that there's this strong uneven distribution of resources, access to facilities, etc., coupled with diverse forms of exclusion and discrimination. So questions around for me, okay, to what extent do we try to go back in sport to some business as usual, or the work I've done on diversity and inclusion, where lots of sport organizations say, all that inclusion stuff is really not core business. It's an add-on, right? So in an environment now with further resource constraints, what does that mean? So who, so it's not just what is the new or now normal, but who are the now or new? Are we narrowing the base back, white, middle-class, heterosexual men? Are we seeking opportunities to widen it? What does that look like? What new forms are emerging that may be more self-organized, away from the constraints and limitations of structures such as club-based sport, maybe for the rise and the further sort of flourishing of informal groups including population groups who might feel a sense of exclusion or discrimination or being marginalized in mainstream sport. Particularly so, answering these questions takes sort of a critical intersectional approach. So I've been doing some work with the Center for Multicultural Youth, who've been getting lots of reports already from particularly newly arrived girls, young men and women, that they feel the pandemic is exacerbating their already lower participation, yeah, and they're experiencing higher levels of social isolation and also particularly discrimination. Particularly some of the sort of Southeast Asian Australian communities have been reporting that. And so the Centre for Multicultural Youth is sort of trying to work with us as researchers of, hey, you know, what's happening here and what strategies might we develop sort of to counteract that and actually try to produce more positive change. That's the third question. The fourth one I've inserted deliberately because I'm not much of an expert on globalization, but I know we have David Rowe and we have Catherine Palmer, who wrote a fantastic book on sport policy that has a strong globalization element to it as well. So maybe this is more a question for further discussion, because if I think sort of a key staple of the sociology of sport in sort of late modernity has been around that globalization of sport. David's been a leading scholar on that. I'm personally informed sort of by the work of Norbert Elias, historically, and Zygmunt Bauman. So really, how is this now impacted? So what I find really interesting is how will the organizational or the territorial structures of sport and how we experience sport potentially change? So I'm really interested, I've always been interested in Roland Robertson's concept of the glocal, and Richard Giulianotti's taken that on, of course, and they've written about that. What I find really interesting, is there a potential relocalization or re-territorialization of sport and leisure experiences? So I see that, for example, now and therefore also a rethinking of community, this sense that community is no longer place-based, which is kind of a key staple of theorizing on the part of, for example, Zygmunt Bauman. Well, how is that being affected now when, if you live in Melbourne, you would have gone through news listing postcodes that now are in complete lockdown. And so I suddenly find myself identifying with people in my postcode in ways that I never even considered that my postcode was relevant or suburb in that way. How classification, segregation, so labeling are techniques of government, right, to organize responses to COVID. And how does that affect sort of how we engage with sport and leisure? So finally, David, is that 10 minutes? Finally, and I'll leave it there, I've been doing a lot of work in sport for development, and there I think at the global level, going back to macro, how are power relations in sport for development, particularly donor-recipient relations, affected? So there's been a strong critique of sport for development that it tends to involve, through funding channels and sort of hierarchies, sort of a re- or neo-colonization of the global south through these do-good organizations. And actually, you know, and so that's quite interesting. How is that now exacerbated in this new kind of funding environment, and where also the brunt of the impact is felt and distributed unevenly across different parts of the world? So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Ramón. And I mean, Catherine was talking about bringing in leisure, and the idea of the ludic, you know, which I think is very important, because it's sometimes we kind of forget the playful side of sport. It's so performative and it's so tied up with business and various political agendas. So thank you for that. And okay, so last of our speakers, the clock's about to start, is Catherine Palmer from the University of Tasmania.
Okay. Thanks, David. And I work across three main areas: sport and alcohol, fitness philanthropy, and sport wellbeing and social change. I've got two main projects on the go, one that looks at fitness philanthropy and the other that looks at sport and alcohol. So I'll talk briefly about what's involved with both of those projects, because they've both been impacted by COVID in different ways. And this in turn has opened up the space for thinking about the impact and contribution of the sociology of sport to understanding and influencing the new or the now normal across social life in and beyond sport. And so my sport and alcohol project is part of a wider interest in drinking patterns, identities and cultures in Australia. And then within that, my interest is in some of the new and emerging patterns and cultures that tend to fly under the radar when we think about sport and alcohol. So I'm not interested simply in, you know, kind of pissed up footy players behaving badly. I mean, that's certainly part of it. But I'm interested particularly in women and sport-related drinking. And I've got an ARC discovery project with Steve Jackson from the University of Otago that's looking at women, sport and alcohol. And my work on sport and alcohol also looks at athlete addicts and their experiences of alcohol use and misuse. And in terms of COVID, this area of alcohol use and misuse is of particular importance as we continue to grapple with the ways in which the pandemic has either introduced new or exacerbated old problems associated with alcohol consumption, especially for vulnerable people, and certainly in Tassie, especially for people in regional communities. So the ready accessibility of home delivery, the absence of any checks and balances in online purchases, the ability to drink at home without any monitoring, all of that presents a set of challenges for those struggling with addiction and mental health issues, which is exacerbated by job layoffs, with sports workers being a key but largely ignored group here. But the work that I want to talk about in a little bit more detail, and I'll share my screen. Share my screen if I can. So the example I want to talk about, you can all see that? Can all see that? Yep, 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 yep. So the example I want to talk about is fitness philanthropy, because this also intersects with COVID in a different way. So the fitness philanthropy work is a sociological investigation of the rise of sports charity. So fundraising for breast cancer or suicide prevention, amongst other things, through taking part in events like the Mother's Day Classic, the City to Surf, and so on. In Hobart, as it is elsewhere, the parks and roadways are, or they were pre-COVID, taken over by people taking part in any number of these sports charity events. We've probably all been tapped up to sponsor someone who's going one of these events as well. And these are all part of a wide and ever-growing philanthropic endeavour that links notions of health, charity and citizenship. And this is what the fitness philanthropy work is looking at. And what I'm interested in are the ways in which fitness philanthropy has come to represent a new form of giving, in which displays of fitness are also increasingly displays of civic engagement, generosity, and being a good person. So there's a physical activity side to the work that responds to broader agendas around healthy lifestyles, healthy communities, and so on. And there's a sociological side to the work as well. And to just give you an example, a slightly extended example of the ways in which fitness philanthropy can make visible a whole range of issues that are of interest to sociologists in and outside of sport and leisure. One of the things that I'm looking at is how fitness philanthropy operates in terms of death and illness within families. And so one of the motivations for participation and fundraising in sports charity events is a participant's own personal loss, grief or bereavement, and the desire to support efforts to cure particular diseases, notably cancer and motor neuron disorders. We might also see COVID coming into play there. So for my book, shameless promotion, which came out earlier this year, I interviewed families who had lost family members, wives, mothers, children, and who drew on their involvement in Ironman triathlon events to raise money for the breast cancers and the brain cancers which had taken the lives of their loved ones. And what I found was that these families used training and fundraising and then participation in sports charity events, in this case, an Ironman triathlon, to construct narratives of illness, death, healing and recovery. So these families turned to sports charity to come back together as a family. And this provided the families with a structure and a purpose for dealing with grief and its aftermath. And that analysis sits alongside another line of research, which argues that participation in endurance sports has the potential for domestic disharmony due to the time that is spent preparing for endurance events, or when participants prioritise leisure activities above the needs of their spouse or family. So that line of research found that managing family, work and endurance sport is heavily gendered, with the male husband or father or the spouse tending to be the athlete around whom domestic life is reoriented to facilitate their training and their racing schedules. But as a counter to this, the experiences of endurance athletes that are motivated by fundraising and philanthropy, while those experiences are undeniably time-consuming, they are seen by the families as being positive and affirming ones, where training runs, travelling to the events, cycling as a family or as a couple and so on. That all provided key opportunities for doing things as a family. So for enabling family practices, which could provide points of focus and time for reflection for the families that are impacted by grief, death and illness. And that connection to grief and recovery hasn't been addressed in other configurations of families and sport and leisure events, despite the growing numbers of families who are affected by death and the diagnosis of a serious illness, and who turn to fundraising through fitness philanthropy. So that was making a contribution to the sociology of families and reading lots of interesting work there, and as well as to sport. What I want to finish up quickly with is how COVID has changed the nature of fitness philanthropy. So the requirements of physical distancing mean that mass gatherings aren't possible. Many events have moved online. So I was really interested in what you were talking about, Ramón, about the digital rituals being disturbed somewhat. And so physical distancing means mass events aren't possible, and the social and economic costs of the pandemic are yet to be fully realised. So what does this then mean for the future of the charity sector and its capacity to mobilise fitness philanthropy for the public good? And along with the catastrophic bushfires earlier in the year, as well as floods and droughts, the need for fundraising and for charitable giving in response to crises has probably never been more compelling, yet our capacity to donate and to participate in fitness philanthropy has probably never been more challenged. So we're needing to find ways to innovate in the charity and philanthropic centres when the usual methods of rallying together to provide aid are becoming more and more difficult. So the fitness philanthropy work has changed shape a bit, and we're now looking at sport, charity and community recovery, and that's bringing in a team of researchers, Kevin Philo from Griffith, Nick Hookway, who I work with at UTAS, and Matt Wade from La Trobe. And when we look to other research for the ways in which communities have used sport to respond and adapt to crises, to traumatic events and to natural disasters, there's a lot that we can apply to our fitness philanthropy work. So Holly Thorpe's work on community recovery in Christchurch in New Zealand following the 2011 earthquakes. Holly's work identifies the importance of communities drawing on recreational sport to improve their own and or others' lives following or during traumatic events like natural disasters in the Christchurch case. And the Fitness Philanthropy Project extends this to examine other mechanisms which can leverage recovery opportunities in communities that are struck by disasters and the pandemic. as well as providing an opportunity for us to reimagine sports charity in this new or this now normal. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm just trying to move your...
Oh, I'll get rid of it, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yes, I'm actually slightly disappointed that you made the time, so I couldn't wave my disciplinary technology.
Sorry.
And could you talk a little, another few seconds just to keep it going? And thank you for that very important area, as you say, of fitness philanthropy, which and congratulations on the book, which clearly deserves to be read. I'll just it's gone off now, so there we go. So that's the those are the formal-ish presentations, and I asked people to jump in, and the first was Linda had a question for Jennifer. That question there, Jennifer?
Yeah, I saw it. Let me go back to
so it. I assume I don't need to read it out, but perhaps you could respond to it.
Yeah, sure. So I've just quickly typed up a list off the top of my head. So
actually, perhaps we should say what the question is in case people are watching and not.
Oh, right, yeah. So the question is, what was the breakdown of types of activity providers, sports, arts, other, private, not-for-profit, and was there a notable difference between those sports organisations that would have been funded by federal government? So I think I've got 12 here. So they were cycling, visual art, basketball, taekwondo, 3 community language schools, skipping, Special Olympics, coding, and boxing / functional fitness. So it was quite a mix of different providers, different activities, different sports. I think out of the sporting ones, only the cycling was not-for-profit and the others were all private for-profit ones. Oh, so there was also dance, yes, as I spoke about in the presentation. Everything else was, although the sport ones were for-profit, the ones that were funded by the government were the language schools, the 3 community language schools. So they're heavily subsidized by the government, and all the rest, if we're just looking at the list, I think Special Olympics is also subsidized. No, it's not subsidized. She actually told me that it's all based on fundraising. It's they rely heavily on charities and it's just basic fundraising. So yeah, they're nearly all kind of for-profit organizations. Yeah. Is there anything else that you wanted to know based on that?
Do you want to follow up, Linda, with that?
Thank you. I was just really interested because typically if a sporting organisation is funded through federal government or state government funding, there's quite strict kind of expectations around their equal opportunity and anti-discrimination. So I was just wondering if at the level that you were interviewing at that community level, those kind of, directives that I would have expected to be played out, or be expectations of that funding, how they were being played out, and if there was a difference there.
Yeah. So from the stuff I'm reading about sports clubs, they do have certain policies, and aims in getting, more equality. But because these are for-profit organisations, and they're usually sort of sole trader ones too, so it's like their own business, they're self-employed. Basically, they don't have to follow any directive. They're free to do whatever they like. And that's why I mentioned about the neoliberal market approach, because for them, it's just a business. And they're trying to make a profit, basically. Yeah. So there is a big difference.
Yeah. I think it's kind of interesting to compare like the carrot and the stick to a certain extent. Like some would make the argument that if it is a for-profit organisation, they would be interested in diversifying and reaching into as many different kind of markets as they possibly could. But like what you're saying is that some are not taking that approach. Whereas if it was a not-for-profit kind of club that was driven by volunteers, they also may not have the investment in you know, sticking to those policies or playing them out per se. And it's more just a kind of survival kind of attitude. So yeah, just interesting to see what.
Yeah, I don't have the numbers to make, you know, any definite conclusions. As I said, I only had the one kind of volunteer-based, you know, not-for-profit place, which was the cycling club, and they were, as I said, that was the place that was most interested in equality, but that was the only one, so I don't really have anything to compare it with.
Thanks for that, Linda. It occurred to me that as you were asking the question that perhaps we would intuitively have thought that before the sports rorts affair, where it seems like federal government money and then subsequently in New South Wales state government money was, you know, handed out to organisations with very little by way of guidelines in terms of equity or anything else other than who you vote for. Anyway, I've got a few questions, and Ramón asked one of me, but deferred to another person who's not a presenter, except that Linda asked the same question, asked me to, so I'll just address it quickly. So the question from Ramón is, refers to the impact of the pandemic on esports, which appear to be one of the fastest growing forms of sport. In other words, has the pandemic given a real fillip to esport? Well, Brett Hutchins and I, people would know Brett from Monash University, we wrote a book 8 years ago called Sport Beyond Television, where we talk about esport and it's the coming of esport. And esport's a little like virtual reality. It's been coming for a long time. I mean, it makes a bit of an advance, but never today quite as much as has been predicted. But increasingly people say, well, actually perhaps it has arrived now because of the physical distancing and the other logistical problems brought about by the pandemic, that the moment of esport has come, and there's a kind of intersection or interpenetration of physical and esport. And I mean, I've been doing quite a lot of work. I mean, I wouldn't dignify it with research, but tracking about the way that mediated sport has been conducted during the pandemic. And I found myself talking on, you know, Al Jazeera and Al Jazeera English television about faking of sport and what, you know, the like sports crowds. How do you make a sports spectacle without a crowd? And I mean, fascinatingly, the crowd noises that you hear in esports have largely been sampled from actual physical crowds. But when actual physical games have been going on without crowds, they have then borrowed materials from esport games like FIFA and the NBA and put them on physical sport encounters. So you know, really weird things happening like that. The involvement of virtual fandom and virtual play. So very good question. That, I mean, could it be that one of the big beneficiaries of the pandemic, because there will be beneficiaries, of course, not just big pharma, but other beneficiaries could well be esport. So, but the reason that I'm a little hesitant there is because when I've been talking to Brett Hutchins about it, he said, "Oh yes, yet again we've been hearing this story, you know, before." And it reminds me, I used to teach virtual reality back in the 80s to students at the University of Newcastle, and it was always the coming thing that was going to take over, but didn't and still hasn't. Okay, so there's a question also from Ramón. I'll just hold you off on on yours. Sorry, I hope I don't miss it, but from Sharon. This is for the whole panel, so I'll be quiet for a moment. Thoughts on equality and gender in sport. Any thoughts on coaches and the importance, necessity of seeing equality in sport coaches by players and community? So it's open to the panel. They're nervous.
No, I think we're all just being polite. Yeah, I think absolutely it is important that we have more diversity within sports at every level, in every space, in every opportunity, whether that's coaching, whether that's on the board, whether that's on the field, and so on and so forth. And it is one of those you can't be what you can't see things as well. I've been following the debate, albeit slightly peripherally, about Lisa Alexander, who was the Australian netball coach who applied for a football, I forget the team, and didn't make the shortlist. And there were debates that went around that about whether the extent to which to coach a sport you needed to have played the game and to be kind of sort of intrinsically on top of the rules, the players, the strategies and so on, or whether there was something about coaching and a particular set of skills that you might have around leadership and bringing people together and motivation and so on, that are about a person's kind of interpersonal and emotional capacities, irrespective of the sport. So I think it's a live conversation. It's a live debate. And yeah, I mean, absolutely, we need to have more women. We need to have more trans. We need to have more people reflecting and being a part of the diversity of the communities that we're all a part of.
I don't know if anyone else wants to say something, but
Jennifer, did you want to jump in, or are you happy for me to?
You can go first.
Okay. I totally agree with Catherine. So representation matters. What I was going to say to Sharon as well. So there's a few interesting papers have come out. So I actually cited one. It's on my first slide by Madeline Paper and Fiona McLaughlin, and that talks about the gender precarity in sport and sort of the risk of that being exacerbated in the current climate. And you see it sort of, for example, around the cost-cutting measures. You see it with the AFL women's. You see it with, I think, the Tour de France for women being, I think, was first cut this year. And we've actually seen it in other forms of diversity as well. Yes, I remember Dylan Alcott sort of protesting against the cancelling of the wheelchair tennis. And so it's happening. This is what I said before. Like, what are we doing? Are we narrowing? Like, who is that now normal? I think there's a real risk there. But at the same time, Fiona McLaughlin and I did some research with local clubs in sort of western suburbs of Melbourne. And there were also opportunities. So there were actually some of those clubs who actually sort of saw opportunities for inclusive growth. They're actually starting women's competitions now and starting online, but already thinking 2 steps ahead. So it's both. Right? It's both. So I think there's real risk and opportunities kind of in that way, as it usually is. Yeah. But there is real, I think, yeah, it's something that is really, particularly in terms of pay as well. So at the elite level. So I think this is the risk. Yeah. Catherine and I completely agree that it's important, for example, with the coaching. And I think it's also under a lot of pressure. It's both. And so I think for Sharon, if you're interested, the ISA, so the International Sociology of Sport Association, had at its conference a really interesting panel on exactly this. So gender equality in sport, and I think that's recorded. So if you're interested, I can flick you the link. Yeah, because that's available online.
Jennifer, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk briefly about another project I did a few years ago. So I don't really have anything to share from this project as such yet. But a few years ago, I interviewed the women who played for the Auburn Giants. So it was an AFL team founded by a Muslim woman. And the team wasn't all Muslim, though. They had some other people from other backgrounds. And I remember one interview with someone from a Chinese background. So what they do is they usually the team members, they coached the younger teams as well. So they had 2 sort of junior teams. And she was saying that she felt it was really important that she was the coach and coaching them so they could see, it's like an Asian woman coaching AFL. Like she said, when I was growing up, I never saw any of that. It's always white people on TV. It's always white people playing sport. And obviously you can tell I'm also Asian background, and I've never seen Asian people playing sport anywhere on TV, sporting fields or anything. So I was just imagine how mind-blowing that would have been for me growing up to have like a female Asian sports coach, and what a sort of an impression that would have made on me, rather than just seeing all white people. I think it's like a subconscious thing, almost like you don't consciously think about it, because when I interviewed parents whose kids were playing AFL Auskick, and they were nearly predominantly Muslim backgrounded kids, and one of the questions the AFL wanted me to ask them was, do you prefer to have like coaches from Anglo-Saxon backgrounds or coaches from your own background? And they all of them, without exception, said, no, we're fine, absolutely fine with the white Anglo-Saxon coaches. So they're perfectly fine with it, and nobody said like, oh no, I want a Muslim coach, or I want someone from my ethnic background, or anything like that. So that's like the conscious thought was, it doesn't bother me, it's absolutely fine. But I wonder if there's some subconscious feeling as well that, oh, if I see someone from my own background, that kind of is somehow different, or than having a white coach. I don't know. Nobody explicitly said anything about that, but this is just my own impressions.
Okay, thanks for that, Jennifer. Yeah, just very briefly, my 2 penny worth is that, obviously you be familiar with the term stacking, which is used in sport around, it normally refers to race, and to some extent class, like who gets to be the captain of the team, and then that kind of ripples upwards. And talking, specifically about gender, yes, there's a real difference of practice and principle, I think, in which men are licensed. It's normal for men to coach women, but not the other way around. It's quite unusual. But why stop at coaches? Moving up, through in sport, through management and owners, you get that same kind of stacking that goes on. And I would raise a quick question, because I wrote a conversation article about it. I was just thinking about it. Would Angela Williamson have been sacked by Cricket Australia if there were, for essentially exercising her reproductive rights under Australian law, if there had been more women in senior management roles in Cricket Australia? So I think those questions go on, right from team level through coaches to senior management, ultimately to in the case of private sports, owners of teams. Okay, so I'm keeping my eye on the time, and we had a question for Adele masquerading as Kim from Ramón, which did you see the question there, Adele?
Yes, thank you.
So the question is, based on your expertise, how do you anticipate the affective landscapes of sport and leisure to be changing, if at all?
Well, thank you for the question. I've been doing quite a bit of new research about the return to sport post-COVID here in Queensland. But in regards to that particular question, I think that it is changing the affective landscapes of sport, in that So on one hand, sport has been positioned as really important to the recovery of Australia after this shared traumatic event of COVID and lockdown and economic loss. So sport's positioned as really important to that. Yet on the other hand, sport is already quite an exclusionary, there are a lot of different issues with maybe bullying in regards to, it could be sexism, homophobia, and just all different kind of cultural aspects of sport. You join a team and it's not that easy unless you agree with the kind of group mentality at times to fit in. So I think that in some ways sport, unless there are, some kind of interventions, I think that it could become a more prickly space if you think about it in terms of affects. And I mean, I'm very concerned about all the people, including children, who have been, we're quite privileged. I mean, some of us may have had a pretty disturbing time in lockdown, but, a lot of people in Melbourne, for example, months and months of being in lockdown, some of them on their own, and just, the mental health effects of that, the disconnected, the disengagement, and thinking about how can sport better support these people, sport and recreation, and, sport and leisure. So I do think that the sporting landscape effectively is changing. There are increased risks, so a sense of fear. We know from ABS data that anxiety is through the roof for Australians. So how does that work? Like, sport helps anxiety, but there are also anxieties in participating. So it's not a simple kind of thing. So yeah, I can say that. I mean, about coaches, I did last year or this year interview strength and conditioning coaches about gender. And I think Catherine raised that important point about the experience. Do you have to have that experience in order to be able to coach and have expertise on a topic? And I think it's something that I'm really interested to think about in the future as well, not just in sport, but at different fields where experience is either dismissed or highly regarded. So yeah, before my academic career, I worked in the drug and alcohol field. So that's another area in addiction where this question of lived experience comes up a lot, and sport. So yeah. But this is so great. Thanks for organising, David.
Thank you. All right. Well, thanks. Thanks for the response. And I don't know, would anyone else want to comment about sport and affectivity? Oh, I see. Oh, that's a hand. That means. Thank you. Yes, that's what it's a kind of strange design, because when I first saw that, I thought someone was putting their hand up for a question, but that's another thing. So thank you for that, Sharon. But does anyone else want to respond to that whole issue about sport and affect at the moment? Okay, so we've got a few minutes left, and I don't know if there's there's some issue that we haven't really covered, or we should go back and revisit. Does anyone please?
I did put a comment there about esports. I noticed that the AFL quickly set up a competition, an esport competition, trying to keep people engaged during the shutdown. And I thought that was really clever, having, popular players in the men and the women's competition playing these online live games. Yes, I thought that was really interesting, because about keeping in the imagination and things like that. And I think esports are really interesting in terms of masculinities and femininities. A lot of the time, men are, a lot of young boys are using women's avatars when they play, and that's considered cool. It's super cool. I mean, my son's 8, so apparently it's full sweat, he says. And all of the YouTube channels that he watches, the best and most revered skins are these women's skins. And there's no you know, teasing or anything. So there's a lot of fascinating things within esports that I think as sociologists of sport and leisure we can contribute to, while not necessarily seeing esports as taking away from physical activity, that it doesn't have to be an either or kind of game. So.
Well, certainly esports is becoming increasingly sportified, one might say, in a professional sense. I mean, I assume people are aware that, I mean, there are now major esport events where, and there are people who are actually living as professional esporters. You know, they actually make decent money. The elite ones do in a way analogous to elite sport. It's not as big yet in practice terms. It's certainly big as an industry in terms of people buying the technologies, the hardware and the software of it. An area that, again, that Brett Hutchins and I and Andy Ruddock, also from Monash University, have worked on for a few years, is the idea of the I call it the executive fan, in around my football club, where, you know, we're talking about globalization and fan communities. So you can actually form practicing sport clubs now that in which you pick the team. You know, I mean, the motto of my football club from the first decade of this century was own the club, pick the team. So people are joining, they're picking teams, they're making decisions on transfers of players, which sponsors, the shirt. I'm wearing my shirt here is to show you, that's Ginster's. They make pasties because they come from the west country of England. So that's the. But if I was part of a virtual, say, football team in this case, then we would be making collective decisions on our sponsors and various arrangements. And also, this is now leaching into esports with people owning esports teams and intervening in terms of player recruitment and all kinds of remarkable things. So we are moving into that new world. Ramon, did you have your hand up?
David, it's really interesting. So you referred to, you know, esports being sportified. What I recognize from what Adele said, my boys are 6 and 9, and they had their soccer training kind of online. Also, some of those traditional team sport being, if only temporarily, desportified. So, for example, the coaching there is no rules anymore, right? The whole time space is different. So it's basically dribble a ball up and down the stairs, around the tables, go out the front door, come back through the hallway, breaking vases, stuff like that. You know. And actually, when I talked about the ludic and that's actually beautiful. I really enjoyed that. It was much more. So my son said at some point, I wrote here, "Oh, Dad, this is not soccer. This is parkour." So he's basically navigating his way with a ball on his feet. That was really, really interesting. He says, I can only go outside for an hour, but in here with my ball, it's kind of part parkour, part soccer. So maybe we're starting to see more, I don't know if it's even hybrid, but like a broader range of stuff that doesn't lend itself to being pigeonholed. Way more sort of intertwined and sort of, I find that one of the most memorable moments of seeing physical activity happening sort of right here in this living room where I'm sitting now.
Well, thanks for that comment. If we go much further, we'll start revisiting postmodern theory and the hybridity.
And new materialisms as well, of course. Adele, I know we haven't gone there, but fits right in. So I acknowledge that.
It is, indeed, it is too. So there are many directions we can go in, but we are at the end of our time now. So just, I think, an opportunity for me to wrap up, just to thank everyone for an excellent session. I really enjoyed it, and I'm pleased that it will have a life that goes beyond this, relatively small group. So as I warned everyone at the start, I'm going to do my clap too. I warned everyone at the start that this will be uploaded, hopefully cleaned up a little bit at the beginning and the end. We haven't talked about editing yet, but by TASA, and then made available. But I found it very useful not just to hear my esteemed co-participants, but also the questions that we've elicited. And I think we've made a pretty persuasive case that sociology of sport and leisure has a lot to contribute here. And I think people are contributing importantly in the academic sphere, in the media, at the community level, all kinds of directions. So thank you very much all. I feel a little ludic now. I may go and do something ludic, playful, having got through the anxiety of yet another Zoom meeting. So thank you very much, everyone. All the best. Cheers. And thank you especially to Jennifer, who held my hand through the Zoom experience. All the best. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.